Steve, let me get this straight. You're saying that you've removed the radio in your car. That's right, because you've discovered an audio show that beats anything you've ever heard on FM. Yeah, that's right. Okay, are you mad? No. What have you found then? Well, it's this guy, Harry Morgan. He does this show thing. It's called, it's on YouTube too, does running videos. It's called Jog On, Jog On. It's all I listen to now. Hello, Harry here, and welcome to Jog On. We aim to produce high-quality audio and videos for the world of running. Jog On also has a YouTube channel called Jog On with Harry Morgan, and we've created some really great stuff that I'm very proud of, so go check it out and subscribe. If you enjoyed this episode of the podcast or have been enjoying Jog On for some time, recommend an episode to one friend who might enjoy it. It really does help us get out there a little bit more and grow. Thank you, guys. It's episode time. Right now, in the world, there are just 10 people who have run every single London Marathon. The youngest of the 10 is now in his 60s, and, quite by chance, I met him. During that brief encounter, I introduced myself, and he agreed to sit down with me to tell me his story. And what a story about a life full of running. The accolades are substantial and numerous. The AAA 100k champion in 2003, the AAA 24-hour champion in 2008, the world record for the most successive sub-3-hour London marathons, a staggering 33 in a row, sub-3-hour marathons across 5 decades, 14 GB or England vests for ultra racing, the first person to complete the London 2012 Olympic Marathon test course, represented England at the Commonwealth Games Ultra Championships, and in 2011 ran across America in 79 days and 22 hours. During our conversation, we talked about the highs and the lows.
20 emotions flashed through my mind.
It's all over.
Your mind thinks very fast in those circumstances. Because I was quite badly injured, but there was disbelief, denial, anger, shock, horror, disappointment.
The pain and mental battles that come with endurance racing.
When it's 2 hours before dawn and nothing seems to change, it just seems to be dark, dark, dark. There are no birds singing, there's no sun coming up.
And left me with some deep thoughts about making the most of the time that we have.
Nobody on their deathbed ever wished they'd spent more time at work.
It was a genuine honour to converse with this man, and I hope you enjoy our conversation half as much as I did. So please, welcome to Jog On, Chris Finill. One of the things that was interesting was to go right back to the very start of you and running, Chris, is I watched it in an interview you talk about that you used to run to get cigarettes for your mother, and that was one of your earlier memories. Is that kind of about where it starts for you? Where does that passion for running begin?
Yes, I think certainly my mother's smoking habit was kind of instrumental in me running to the shops, and running to the shops meant I could time myself or have a sense of how quickly I was running. And so that concept of running and some sort of performance measurement kicked in fairly early. Allied with that, I was born in Whitmore Road in Harrow, which was the road that Roger Bannister lived in. So I kind of, at the back of my memory banks, had a very early awareness that there was this connection with running, and maybe that slightly fed into the whole thing as well. And I was lucky enough to go to a school when I was 11 where there was a very strong sporting ethos and some very decent runners a few years above me who inspired me. So that was also a very, very important part of my enthusiasm for running, as opposed to the rugby and the cricket and the football that I was also doing at the time.
And was the school sort of cross-country focused at the time? Did you do much track back in that day?
I started track more as somebody who got off a day off school by helping with to rearrange the hurdles at the local athletics events. But certainly there was a very strong cross-country ethos at the school, and it was the means by which you got out of playing rugby. And by the time I was 16 and being a typical runner, I wasn't really built to be full-back in the rugby team, which is where I was positioned. So I thought, well, in terms of trying to enhance the length of my life, I'd like to get off the rugby field and start taking running really seriously. And luckily, the master in charge of cross-country at our school was a 2:19 marathon marathon runner. A guy 2 years above me at school, Phil O'Brien, ran marathon for the Commonwealth Games in '86 in Edinburgh. So, and we had a very good team. I was the fifth or sixth best runner in the team out of 6 runners. So we were successful, and I was a small part of that success. And again, that was very encouraging.
Did you find the success quite quickly, or as you were growing, did you start to find that the times were getting a bit quicker, or was it pretty much from the outset you thought, no, I've got a bit of an ability here?
I knew I was a decent runner, but I always trained and mixed with people who were better than me, and that was probably a good thing, really. For instance, I competed for Harrow Athletic Club in the British League for a number of years, but I was never good enough to be a 5K or a 1,500 metre runner. I just didn't have the speed. But I was a decent hurdler, so I could get into a good team as a B-string steeplechaser, and so I competed at a fairly high level and was surrounded by people who were better than me, and I think that kept me wanting to improve and kept me from thinking this is easy, I can win, why should I bother anymore? I was always trying to improve and catch up with the people who were faster than me. I think that was a good thing looking back on it.
It's ironic that it was the smoking habit that is the kind of the thing that leads to the sheer fitness, sort of two ends of the spectrum there. But I guess that leads me to think that maybe you didn't come from a family of runners. It wasn't something in the background. Were you the first to do this, or did your father or grandfather have much experience?
My father was a very good cricketer, and he always wanted me to be a cricketer, and I can remember him taking me out into the garden when I was 7 or 8 and teaching me the intricacies of a forward drive and all the rest of it. And my heart wasn't really in it. I was reasonably sporty as a child at most sports, but my heart wasn't really in it. My grandfather was a very good cyclist. My mother was a hurdler, so maybe that's where the steeplechase came from. But generally speaking, my family weren't particularly sporty. But as I say, at school, it was an all-boys grammar school. The currency of respect, if you like, was being good at sport. And so there was always a pressure to be good at something. And although in the initial stages I was playing rugby and cricket and those sorts of mainstream sports, it was always with an eye to taking up running. For instance, on Friday afternoons, we'd run down to the rugby pitches to play rugby. But for me, the big event was the run down to the rugby pitches. And there was a sort of unofficial race to see who could be first to the rugby pitches. And by the time I got to the rugby pitches, the sporting side of the afternoon was kind of over in one sense, because the rugby was very secondary to seeing if I could beat other boys down to the pitches.
My experience was quite similar. I came from how schools sort of specialise in a sport. They have a sport they're known for, and I went to a school that was rugby. That was the big thing. And similar story. I just try and get out of the matches. I hated the idea of being tackled, all that. And one of the things they would actually do would be to make you run laps if you'd misbehaved or done something wrong. And I used to ask if I could.
That's the treat, isn't it?
Exactly. For me, that was the joy, and yet for everyone, cross country was talked about like this horrible thing that was coming to. And like you, I felt like a bit of an outsider. And
I think certainly at my school, it was, who are the hardest people on the rugby pitch? Who can tackle the lowest? Who are the most fearless people as they pick the ball up and run with it? But cross country has a kind of image of being quite a tough sport as well, and lots of people say, I don't want to do cross country, it's too muddy, it's too cold, it's too wet, it's too hard. And of course the fact that it was seen as a tough sport was something that really attracted me to it, because I wanted to be good at something that was seen to be quite difficult rather than something that was played on a lovely summer's day when the sun's out and the birds are singing.
Were you quite tall at a young age?
No, I was just looking back on an old picture of me in a rugby team. When I was 14, I was probably the smallest person on the pitch, but I'm now 6'1", so I'm quite tall for a runner, but I've always been able to be quite skinny and slight, and that was one of the reasons why I wasn't really particularly suited to playing rugby.
You've always been, I know you mentioned that you were never going to be a 5K or a 10K, but your 5K, 10K PBs speak for themselves, pretty sharpish. Correct me if I'm wrong on any of these. 15:34 around 1987 and a 33:37 in 91.
Yes, they're reasonable track times, but I surrounded myself by people who were competing in National League Division 1. So you turn up at some of those matches and you've got some serious runners many's the time I've stood on the starting line and been asked to run 5K and, which isn't my event, at a meeting where there's a really good selection of athletes. And I'm thinking, there are 16 runners here. I'm going to come 14th, 15th, or maybe last. But it's all context, isn't it?
Absolutely.
You have to see your performance in the context in which it's set.
And it's a very healthy thing for you to have grown up around being such a good team at school and then beyond those start lines with all those amazing runners. It kind of keeps your ego in check, I think.
Yes.
And because on paper, compared to most people, those are phenomenally fast times. But then you go to a certain particular race and all of a sudden you're like, I'm nowhere kind of thing.
Yeah, no, I've always seen myself as a very middling track athlete. But when I started to move up the distances to ultras, I was actually comparatively fast for an ultra runner because I'd had that discipline, if you like, or that background in 3,000 metre steeplechase and 5Ks on the track. I hadn't gone from cross country to ultras. I'd done track for many, many years as a complementary thing to cross country. And then I moved into ultras when I was in my 30s. So I had a background of reasonably fast races behind me. And so my cruising speed when I turned to ultras was actually quite good because I was a relatively fast 5K runner.
Your greater successes came at those longer distances, like you say. Do you credit that foundation of speed built in those kind of middle to long distances of the 5 and the 10Ks as something that led to you being more successful at those longer distances?
Yes, completely. I think I was possibly went to ultra running too late. Maybe looking back on it, I should have tried ultras when I was in my 20s. It's the obvious thing to do. But most people go through the distances and don't really arrive at distances beyond marathon, perhaps until their 30s. And I'm a classic example of that. But I think the background in track, Harrow is a very track-based club. There's not a lot of running over marathon. There's virtually no running over marathon distance. I'm one of, for the last 25 years, I've been the only ultra runner in the club. Latterly, it's picked up with other runners as well, as ultra running has become more mainstream. But it was a very track-based club. It remains a very track-based club. And so I naturally tried to compete on the track in the summer. And I think that did give me a reasonable background in speed for an ultra runner.
So it was around that shift as you moved into 30s that you just started to move up the distance. Do you recall what it was that gave you the idea? I think I'd like to try something at that distance.
Well, actually, we come back to the London Marathon. I started to take part regularly in the Orion 15 cross-country race, which takes place in March, which is organised by Orion Harriers and is in Epping Forest. And it's a really fantastic race, classic 15 miles of brutal cross-country. And one of the guys who was running for Orion Harriers at the time, who sadly died since, is John Legg. And John was a real ambassador for British ultra running, as well as being a London Marathon ever present, which is how I got to know him. I decided to take part in the London to Brighton race in the 80s and the 90s. Well, actually, from the 50s onwards, it was run from Big Ben to the shores down in Brighton. 55 miles, Ditchling Beacon, you can imagine some of the terrain. So anyway, I took part in that for the first time in 96, I think, by which time I was 37. I rocked up to the start without really a clue as to what I was doing, other than it was going to be a long day. In those days, you had 6 or 7 boxes. You'd put the food you wanted at 5 miles or 10 miles in the respective boxes, and they were shipped off. So I put a banana in at about 20 miles and another banana at 40. Yeah. And I think I had a bottle of Coke at 45. And that was my nutrition for 7 or 8 hours. And of course, it all fell apart quite badly. And I got to Ditchling Beacon and absolutely, completely exhausted. Somebody had the foresight to get a bar of chocolate from a petrol forecourt, which I ate, furiously, and that got me through for the last 6 or 7 miles down to Brighton. And I went back the following year in the light of that experience and ran considerably better. And then another ever-present at the time, Mick McGeoch, who organises the Barry 40 track race each year and has done for many, many years. And he said, why don't you come and try a track race? So I rocked up in March to run the Barry 40 track race in 2000, and I won it on not a huge amount of training. And John Legg was down there. John was connected with British Ultra Running, and he said, right, you ought to try and take this seriously. And at the time I thought, well, I'm 40, I'm too old for this. But of course, 40 isn't too old for ultra running.
In ultras, it's not.
It's a very good age. So he persuaded me to then keep at it. I got selected to run for England in the Anglo-Celtic Plate. Then I got selected to run for Great Britain in 100Ks. And so the whole thing built. And once I realised relatively late in my running career that I could actually compete at international level, it was like a second summer, really. At the time when I thought my running career was beginning to wind down a bit.
It's sort of picking up.
It was picking up, and some of my best races and some of my very best running experiences have been, as you might imagine, travelling to relatively exotic, distant places and competing internationally.
Yeah, there's some amazing endurance races around the world, and certainly ultras explore incredible places, like you mentioned, about just crazy environments and stuff. And are there any particular ultras that stand out that you remember particularly enjoying, mountainous, forest-wise or otherwise, outside of this country? Or
yes, I think 2. The first is the Comrades, which is just a lovely celebration of running. I think it's the largest ultra race in the world. You get 14,000 people turning up to run 55 miles. So it's a mass participation event, although it's such a long race as well. It doesn't seem to put people off. It's got a heritage that goes back 100 years. It's like Boston, really. It's got that sort of aura to it. And it's a tremendous race, and I thoroughly enjoyed taking part in that. And the second race that falls kind of into that category is running in Taiwan. I competed in the World 100K Championships in 2003 in Taiwan. And this is a race that took me 36 hours to get to the venue. So luckily, the race wasn't for about 5 days after that. So I had a bit of time to acclimatise. But it was an absolutely brutal race. It was 4 laps, essentially up a valley to halfway up a mountain, turn around, come back down again, and repeat 4 times. And this was held in brutal conditions as well, very humid, very hot. Massive altitude climbs and falls, but high-class competition as well. And I ran well that day. It was just as well because I'd travelled 8,000 miles or whatever it was to take part. I was going to travel 8,000 miles back again. But that was a real high point for me.
At that time, how did you juggle job and training? I mean, anyone who's done a marathon knows that taking on a marathon, if you train properly for it, it's like taking on a part-time job. How do you juggle that day-to-day living?
I think for me, I've never done big miles. All my marathons I've done on about 35, 40 miles a week. Pretty much the same with ultras as well. The ultra races started to be, in a way, the training for the next ultra, but I didn't train big miles between races. I didn't run more than about 40 miles a week whilst I was in the middle of my ultra running.
Is that a training philosophy of trying to get in the quality over the quantity, or is that just something that you've figured out yourself?
No, I think in my case, by the time I was doing ultras, I'd been running 40 miles a week for 20 years. And that was at the start of my ultra running career, really. So I suppose I'd built up an enormous bank of strength, which is one of the fundamental requirements for ultra running. So I didn't need to work hard to have the strength. Maybe I should have run more miles, but I suppose maybe this is a bit lazy or a bit arrogant. But I thought, well, if I can achieve this level of success on this amount of miles, I don't want to push it and become injured, or push it and have less of a family life, or push it and have less of a career. I had 3 children to bring up with my wife, so there was always a lot of responsibility attached to that. Luckily, I work 5 miles away from where I live, and I have done for 20 years, and there are showers at work, so I can run to work, from work. I can fit it all in as part of my commute, and that's been a huge help to me.
Yeah, it must be. Commutes take up a lot of people's time.
If I were working in London now and
it'd be
having
a nightmare.
3 or 4 hour commute each day, it would be impossible.
Do you think that if you had tried ultras in your 20s, you might have gone any further with it? Or do you think that the time needed in your 20s to run those 5 and 10Ks was actually, you were kind of training and building up towards that ultra?
I think without realising it, it was actually quite good for me. Maybe if I'd turned to ultras when I was 25 or 30, I'd have burnt myself out or got bored with them. But there was a really nice progression in terms of moving up the distances as I became older and more experienced. And I think the two things worked quite well, really. And I think if you want to be absolutely top draw ultra runner, you've probably got to be doing it right from your early 20s. And I missed that boat, but I don't regret it because I still had an ultra career, albeit one that was mainly in my late 30s and 40s and early 50s.
And such high success at it as well. One of the big races that you've done, the AAA 24-hour, you won in 2008.
Yeah.
That is an entirely different format again, actually running for a period of time and trying to get as much distance in as possible. Do you find that kind of race the toughest of all?
I mean, clearly 24-hour racing is a tough concept, and however bad a 20-mile is going, it's going to be over relatively soon. Talking to ultra runners over the years about what's the hardest sort of race, there is a kind of perceived pecking order, and it's not simply a case of the further you go or the longer you're running for, the harder it is. And then that's not to belittle transcontinental races or 6-day races or anything of the sort, but there is a view which I've heard expressed by several more experienced ultra runners than me that actually 24 hours is the hardest race because there's the continual pressure to keep moving. Whereas once you go to 48-hour races or 6-day races, however interminable they may seem, there is the opportunity to have a guilt-free rest.
Yes.
In a 24-hour race, every 5 minutes you're not moving, you're feeling, I should be out there. And in that particular race in 2008, which was my best performance, I reckon I wasn't actually moving forwards. And I wouldn't describe it all as running, because clearly you're walking at times and eating food or stumbling along in the dark, feeling awful. But I wasn't actually moving forward for about 15 minutes of that 24 hours. And that's an enormous amount of pressure. But you have to try and find meaning. 24 hours is a desert, and you have to carve it up and assign landmarks to it. Like, the birds are starting to sing, or I look forward to the sun coming up, or I look forward to brushing my teeth and pretending it's morning, or I look forward to having a really nice supper, or a bar of chocolate, or a cake or something at some point along the way. You have to keep giving yourself those targets to aim for, and it's very, very hard, and it requires an enormous amount of very good support from people who are there to look after you.
Absolutely strong tactics, and also a very strong mental game. I like that idea of sort of slicing up the 24 hours into sort of more manageable chunks and finding the next light at the end of the tunnel to work towards. Obviously, there's a physical ability there. You're built well for it. Do you think that mentally you've always been quite good at going to those darker places and just pushing quite hard and staying in a good mindset?
Yes, I when I'm running, I tend not to have an off switch. I just keep going. And that really helps in ultra running, because people say you don't hit the wall in an ultra, you go through a tunnel. Because in a long race, a 7-hour race, 8-hour race, 12-hour race, you're going to be out there a long time, and you're not going to feel on top of your game for that whole time. But what you've got to do is convince yourself that when you're feeling really bad or things are getting really hard, it's a pendulum swing and it's going to come back and feel better again. You've just got to stick at it and stay out there and keep moving forwards.
It is. It's weird. You sort of, in those moments, you can feel like this is only going to get worse. But there is a weird thing where 5 miles time, you start to feel a bit better. And whether that be a bird singing or you've just had a banana or whatever.
Yeah. And you've got to feed a bit off how other people must be feeling as well. If you've been out there for 18 hours in a 24-hour race, you're tired, but everyone else is as well, and you've just got to convince yourself that they're suffering more than you, so it's worth carrying on and to keep going. In one 24-hour race, I remember there was another guy who I was competing against, and he was in front of me for the first 11 hours, and I just kept telling myself, he's going to blow up, he can't keep going at this pace. And after 8 hours and he's still going at that pace, you think, perhaps I am going to come second, or maybe he's much better than I thought he was. And after 10 hours, you think, he's still going, he's still ahead of me, and he's still looking strong. And luckily for me, this guy blew up at 11 hours. So
wow.
I was out there for 13 hours longer than him in the end. But telling yourself that's all going to be fine when you've been out there a long time and things aren't going well is actually quite difficult. But you just have to take a really long-term view.
So obviously you've had a few 100Ks as well as the 24-hour races. In the AAA 100K championships you won was 2003. Your PB was the year before in 2002. The AAA 24-hour, when you became the champion then, was 2008 when you ran 151 miles. And there must be all these other factors to think about. I mean, first of all, when you start to get that length of distance and that amount of time on your feet, you're dealing with night time. And obviously most races happen in the day, so you've got to be thinking about head torches and spare batteries. Pre a AAA championship when it's coming up, have you got everything meticulously planned out? Like, I've got this amount of batteries and this amount of weight on me, or do you leave that to the team to sort it for you?
Remember, on track races, you tend not to worry about batteries and torches and stuff, but you have to think very carefully about what time of day it is. For instance, that 24-hour race was in September or possibly early October, so it's the time of year when it can be very cold at night and it can be very warm during the day. So as an example, you have to think around about 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening, it's going to get cold quite soon. And it's really important to get clothes on before you start to feel cold, because once you start to feel cold and you're shivering and you're tired, it can spiral out of control pretty quickly and you can start to feel very weak. So as an example, clothing is really important. But somebody does your thinking for you. And Andy would say, well, you need to come in and put some tracksters on, or you need to put a fleece on, or a bobble hat, or whatever it is. But you're right, in the night time, you've got to make sure you're really warm. And of course, when you're running relatively slowly at night time, it's very easy to get cold very quickly. Yeah, so you're running in jackets, tracksters, bobble hat perhaps, hot drinks rather than cool ones, and so on. Some people jokingly, but there is a truth in it, some people jokingly describe 24-hour running as an eating and sleep deprivation contest.
Yeah.
And the running isn't actually mentioned.
No, it's the other parts.
Being able to eat and digest and run is actually quite an important attribute for an ultra run. If you're going to start eating food because you're hungry and then you throw it all up, you're in a really bad place. Yeah, that can be really hard, particularly when it's 2 hours before dawn and nothing seems to change. It just seems to be dark, dark, dark. There are no birds singing. There's no sun coming up. It's cold. Even the supporters have mostly gone home. It's a low point.
You're just following a spotlight along some path.
It really is very, very lonely.
Obviously, the winning the championships and things like that have been the highs, and you've had some real success with the ultras. Quickly touching on the lows, have there been any races? Are there any races that come to mind where you had to pull out because of an injury or you got lost? Have you ever had any major disasters like that?
In ultras, I was picked to run for England in the Commonwealth Games Ultra Championships.
Was that Keswick?
Yes. Commonwealth Ultra Marathon Championships were held for the first time in 2009. And I picked up a groin strain about 8 weeks before the race. I just about shook it off before the race itself, but I'd lost a lot of fitness. And I went.
You couldn't train, I guess.
Yeah, and I went into that race really hoping to do well. And I didn't even score for England in the team, so that was a huge disappointment to me. Although it's not really an ultra race as such, I had a crack at the Bob Graham round in 2017.
Yeah, what was that? It's an amazing race. So just anyone who's never heard of the Bob Graham round, can you just explain what it is?
Yeah, the Bob Graham round is basically a fell running challenge. It takes place in the Lake District. The challenge is to run a particular course, the Bob Graham round, which is 42 peaks in the Lake District, 29,000 miles of ascent and descent. It's about 65 miles, and the challenge is to do it in 24 hours. It's only 65 miles in inverted commas, but of course it's a fell challenge, and some of the hills are monumental, and there are 42 peaks to conquer. It's a circular course. It starts and finishes at Moot Hall in Keswick. Broadly speaking, it's divided into 5 stages. They're all tough. Stage 3 is probably the hardest. It incorporates Scarfell Pike, and some of the really treacherous parts of the Lake District in terms of climbing and descent. I'd aimed to originally do it when I was 42, because there are 42 peaks, and it had a
that'd be quite nice.
Had a neatness to it. But my ultra career took me in other directions, and I never got round to it until 2017, when a friend of mine who lives in the Lake District was able to organise a group of runners to support me if I'd just say, yes, I'll have a crack at it. So it sort of fell into my lap. And so I thought, right, I'll have a go at it. But I'm a goodish road runner and a decent cross-country runner, but fell running is a very different sport. And
it is.
A bit like asking a tennis player to play badminton. I was very good on the uphills and I was okay on the flats, but I was hopeless descending. And so I got very tired. But anyway, I had a crack at it. I got 8 hours into it in horrible conditions, and I lost the sight in my right eye. Because I should have thought more about this, but the rain was coming into it. I could only see with one eye. Not having stereo vision in a really hostile environment where I'm potentially going to be very tired and the weather's awful anyway, we decided to scratch, which was a huge disappointment to me. But,
yeah, of course.
Again, you have to accept that some of these things just aren't going to happen on the day you choose.
Unlucky that you had such bad weather as well, because that's something you just can't decide on at the time. Probably aware, Kilian Jornet did the world record for it some time ago, and he's a spectacular runner. He sort of makes it look so simple.
I think a bit like Kipchoge. I think because he's so good and his reputation is rightly so solid, he can choose which day he does the Bob Graham, and there's a group of really great runners who are absolutely biting his arm off to support him.
Absolutely,
and good luck to him, and he's earned that through his skill and his determination and his talent over the years.
Well, like you say, fell running is people use this umbrella term of running, but within that there are so many categories and columns, and one of those is fell running.
Yes.
Descending hills is a technique in itself.
Absolutely. And I've spoken to quite a few southerners like myself who've gone up north thinking, well, I'm a decent runner, I'll have a crack at a fell race. Running up hills, not a problem. Flat, no problem at all. But of course, you get to those descents and it's a different sport. I found people were taking hundreds of yards out of me on the descent because I was nervously braking, and they were just letting rip and charging down hills with confidence and assuredness that I couldn't match.
So it's partly mental. I guess also it's some kind of muscular thing where your joints are a bit more used to having that spring downwards.
Yeah, yes.
Which is a whole other technique in itself.
It is a different sport, and I somewhat arrogantly assumed that because I was an ultra runner, the 24-hour aspect of the Bob Graham challenge wouldn't be a big deal, and I don't think it would have been. I would have been fine with that, but the downhills and ultimately the weather, I suppose. Maybe I'd have got round if it hadn't been for my eye, but I was finding it hard, and I was finding it harder than I expected to.
Is it something that still weighs on your mind? Is it still something you might do one day?
I think maybe I was a bit... I'm 60 now, and I think 60 is right at the upper end of can you do the Bob Graham round anyway? And,
right.
and I think a combination of being 60 and not being a fell runner probably means it's out of my reach, and I wouldn't want to tee up a load of runners to support me if it was a waste of their time as well as mine.
You'd have to spend a decent amount of time just in the hills.
Yes.
Probably a year or two just doing that alone.
Yes, and I can train around. Obviously, where I live here in Cranley, it's on the tip of the Surrey Hills, so there's lots of hills to train on, but they're not hills you spend 45 minutes running down.
Yeah, I know. It's a different kind of hill.
Yeah, I can charge down a hill, but it's over in 3 minutes, and that's a different kind of hill from the ones in the Lake District, which are generally more hazardous.
Generally, it sounds like most of your running career has been highs. You seem to, apart from the odd groin strain and the Bob Graham attempt and things like that, most of it has been, there's been a lot of success in there. And one of the big things for you has been your consistency over the years. And for example, I think you've gone sub 3 hours for a marathon, something like 5 decades worth now.
Yes.
From the 70s to now. Is sub 3 still on the cards to move that into 6 decades?
Yes, there's a group of athletes around the world now. There are about 45 of us, mostly in America, who've run sub 3 in 5 decades. Be that the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, or more commonly, the 70s, 80s, 90s, zeros and teens. Obviously, 1st of January 2020 is but a couple of months away now. Lots of people out there who've got 5 decades to their name are thinking about 6. Not all of them, because some of them have moved away from that ability to run sub 3 anymore. But there are a few of us who are going to have a crack at it. That's my next target, apart from 40 Londons.
Yeah, it's incredibly consistent. And you speak to most runners and it's plagued with, oh, well, I had a good year here and then I had 3 years off with this crazy injury and then I'm back again. And at least with you, it's this nice kind of slightly more consistent. I'm sure there's been many injuries and all sorts that you've had over the years.
Latterly, there have been a few highs and lows. As I ran with a hamstring injury in 2014, which was the first London I didn't go under 3 hours, which was a huge disappointment. So that's an example of what can happen. Injuries aren't.
It's tough though, because if you do that many in a row in sub 3, every time there's that little bit of pressure, and as the age is creeping in and everything, it is a bit of pressure on you.
Yes.
And maybe was that a slight weight off the shoulders that once you had gone over 3, it's like it's okay to.
In a way, I mean,
just want to complete it.
I went into that race thinking I'm going to give this my best shot. I really hadn't trained for about 2 months because I really wasn't running properly at all.
That's a tough ask.
And I somehow got to about 20 miles, still on sub 3 schedule, and then the sub 3 pacer went past me at about 21 miles, and I just spent the last 5 miles in a kind of very dark place.
I was going to say, what was happening to you? Was it muscles? Was it lungs? Or what was the...
It was a combination of poor fitness because I hadn't really trained properly. My leg wasn't working properly, and so I spent the last 5 miles thinking, well, this is a really dark place. I'm going to finish the race, obviously, but it felt very hollow.
That's tough mentally. Running is doesn't suffer fools gladly. It's just, it's very blunt. This is your number and this is your pace, and that's that.
There's a lot of stark truth out there.
Yes.
When you're off the pace. It's strange, isn't it? Because when you're running well, it seems so easy to run a particular time. And when you're running badly, you're putting in just the same sort of effort, but the clock's telling you something entirely different. And on that day, sadly, I ran 3:10 and that was it. And then you're right, it was a kind of weight off my mind because up till then I'd had a streak of 33 sub 3s and I kissed goodbye to that in a morning.
I think that's a philosophy, that idea of quality miles, not too much quantity, is something that a lot of people could probably take a leaf out of your book on, because I see a lot of runners still getting a lot of injury. I've been a part of a number of clubs now, and the amount of times, oh, where's Tom? Oh, he hasn't been around for a couple of months. He's got that niggle or this thing, and it's a constant chatter within the running world.
Yes.
And maybe that's something we could improve on as runners.
Yes, but I think my personal take on that is that if you run modestly and build up to it and build up to and build up to it over many years, there is a strength there that can see off a lot of the issues people get. But if people come to running in their 30s,
which many do,
and think, right, I'm going to run 75, 80, 90 miles a week, you can build up to that over the course of weeks, months and years, but you're still building up to it relatively quickly.
Yeah.
But that said, hats off to people who do train at 120, 130 miles a week, because that's the only way you're going to be a really world-class runner. You're never going to run sub 2:10 running 40, 50 miles a week. You're going to have to commit to something bolder than that. And of course, in the process of committing to something bolder and more aspirational, you are running the risk of becoming injured. Again, that's one of the other brutal truths of athletics. If you really want something and go for it, you're going to have to really commit to it and hopefully succeed, but there's a danger along the way.
There's definitely something to be said for growing up running. I actually had a conversation with someone recently. I'm not going to speak for very long on this because I have nothing scientifically to back it up, but he'd read a piece regarding the actual artery and vein development being a little bit better for high oxygen intake as a runner when you start running. If you start running at age 10, right up to when you're 40, 50, that foundation, and compared to someone who, if someone starts at 30 and then you both meet at 50, the guy who's been running through his childhood, his whole body is much more geared up for that. And I think that speaks to what you're talking about, which is that biological foundations of my body is used to this.
It sounds very plausible. It sounds common sense. The human body adapts, and as long as it's not pushed too hard too soon, then the sooner that adaptation takes place, I guess the better an adult is to run at a certain speed or a certain effort relative to what they were doing when they were young. I'm a child of the 60s. I was born in 1958, so when I was 8, it was I could go up to the shops and buy the fags for my mother, and it wasn't against the law to buy buy cigarettes in those days as an 8-year-old. My mother used to sort of kick me out of the door at 10 o'clock in the morning, and I'd kick a ball around in the park for hours on end or cycle around the neighbourhood, and nobody knew where I was. There wasn't that peer group pressure amongst mothers to always know where their particular child was. So there was a massive amount of freedom when I grew up, and I could spend all day outdoors running and jumping and kicking a ball. And so that, whether it was running or whether it was running around a football pitch or just being out in the fresh air, there was always that sense of activity, which I guess was a foundation for running in my teens and in my 20s.
So touching on London Marathon, obviously you are one of the few London ever presents. So just explain to anyone who doesn't know what a London ever present means. It's someone who's run every single London Marathon since 1981.
Yes, it's slightly more nuanced than that. The London Marathon gave the status of ever present to the runners who'd competed the first 15 London Marathons.
Got you.
So after the 15th London Marathon awarded a rather lovely medal to those who had completed the first 15. And there were 42 runners who fell into that category. They're all men, no women at all, which is sad, but that's just the demographic. Technically, those 42 runners became ever-presents. And then the more nuanced part of that, of course, is that the word ever-present in the communal sense of the word means somebody who's run all the London Marathons. So those 42 have over the years been whittled down to 10 who've actually run all 39 editions of the London Marathon that have happened up to 2019.
Well, even 42 is not many at all in the grand scheme of things, all the millions of people that have now run the London Marathon. From 1981 onwards, I'm guessing must seem like a bit of a distant memory now on that very first race. What is it that you think that's made you run every single one? Has it become a bit of an obsession?
Oh, not an obsession, but maybe it is obsession now. I ran my first marathon in the States in 1979 when I was 20 because I'd just always wanted to compete in marathons and run distances beyond what was convention. I ran my second marathon in Milton Keynes again in 79, but by this stage I was back in England. I studied in America for a year, but I came back to England in 79, late 79. And of course, the London Marathon took place relatively soon after that. So I was living in southeast England. I ran for a London club. I'm from North London. It seemed the most natural thing in the world to run the first London Marathon, and it was a great experience. Why wouldn't you want to run the second? Why wouldn't you want to run the third? Why wouldn't you want to run the fourth? And I suppose, being a creature of habit, that kind of regularity appealed to me. And in the early days, because I was running times that allowed me to enter automatically through the 3A's route,
yes,
because I had a qualifying time, it wasn't a case of getting a ballot place. I was entitled to a place by virtue of my time. So for many, many years, I got a place simply by being, a reasonable club athlete running faster than 2:40. By the time I'd run 15 of them, yes, it was becoming, I better run the 16th and the 17th. It was becoming something acknowledged by the London Marathon. And when you got a lovely medal saying, congratulations, you've run 15. Why wouldn't you run the 16th? We were given guaranteed entries for life.
Well, I was going to say what a beautiful position to be in.
Yes, I was still getting in by virtue of my times, but I was also had this sort of dual qualification of being an ever-present.
Golden ticket, if you like.
Yes. And these days, we all have guaranteed places as long as we remain ever present. So, unfortunately, 3 days ago, I got an email saying, here's your guaranteed entry. Click on this and you're in.
Oh, fantastic.
So I clicked on that and I am in. I'm very,
I love that.
I'm very privileged and I'm very lucky.
Very much so, yeah.
And I was born at the right time in the right part of England.
A bit of a perfect storm of conditions geographically and ability and just all these different factors that come in.
I ran my first London when I was in my final year at university.
Wow.
So it goes back a long way.
How much has it changed as a race from 81 until now? What have been the big changes that you've observed as an ever-present?
I think the first thing to say is in some ways it's the same race. It's largely the same course, it has a special place in the nation's heart, like it always has had. Yes, of course, it's changed over time. I mean, in the way that the medals have got bigger over time, the race has got bigger over time. It's gone from 6,500, 7,000 runners in the first edition to upwards of 40,000 runners now. The number of people trying to get into it has ballooned over the years. If you're relying on the lottery or the draw to get in, you're going to probably be disappointed many years in a row. But these days, I think it's very mainstream, and the range of people running a marathon is vast.
In 1985, you ran your 2:28, which was the fastest time you did the London Marathon in. First of all, that's ridiculously fast. The other thing was, what position? Do you remember what position that gave you in 1985?
It was inside the first 200. I think it was about 170th, 180th, something like that. So it's not that high up.
Which that's what's so scary, is you can run that fast, and there's still that many people running faster.
Yeah, I think these days the people who could be very good at marathons maybe get drawn into triathlons or cycling or other sports.
There's a lot on offer now.
Yes. That said, I mean, of course, every generation throws up great talents.
You had an incident very recently at one of the London Marathons where you actually fell and broke your arm. Talk me through what happened there and what that process was like. It was quite early on in the actual race itself.
Yes, it was the 2018 edition of the London Marathon, and I went into the race hoping to run 2:56, 2:57. It was all going beautifully till about 5.5k, and I came off the roundabout down by the Thames where the red and the blue merge.
Yes.
Turned left, or in compass terms, headed west. And after about 200 or 300 yards of that particular section, I got clipped from behind, fell to the ground. And unfortunately, rather than just grazing myself, I'd landed in a position that meant my arm locked. So my arm kind of went down at right angles to my body, and the full force of my weight went shooting up my arm. As was subsequently diagnosed, I'd broken my humerus in 4 places.
God.
I think it was about 4.5, 5k into the race.
It's so early in a marathon to do it as well. I mean, if you had like a few more miles to go, okay, let's grin and bear it. But this is basically the beginning of the marathon.
Yes, I mean, I hadn't really got into my stride at this point.
So what happened then?
Well, in the first 5 seconds, there were about 20 emotions flashed through my mind.
It's all over.
Your mind thinks very fast in those circumstances, because I was quite badly injured, but there was disbelief, denial, anger, shock, horror, disappointment. I picked myself up, but I knew straight away something really bad had happened, because I just couldn't move my right shoulder and my arm was just dangling and I couldn't do anything with it. It was completely wrecked. So I jogged along I was being overtaken at this point by a stream of runners.
Well, if you're moving at sub-3 pace already, then you're in a quick field right there.
Reasonably high up the field, but clearly everyone's zooming past me at this stage. And I was bleeding quite profusely from my knee and also from a cut under my elbow. So I went into St John's and, I just thought, give me a sling and I'll get out there again. And of course, they wanted to do a risk assessment on me.
Gosh.
And, what's your name and what's your blood group? And just give me the sling. But they were very good. They were very helpful. And I was in there for about 5 minutes. It seemed longer, and they gave me a cloth bandage which I wrapped around my neck, and luckily my right hand still worked, although my right arm and shoulder were shot, so I could grasp the bandage with my right arm and turn it into what was basically a makeshift sling. And they gave me a couple of paracetamol. I just got out there again, but I thought, just be very, very careful here, because 2018 was a very, very warm year. It was an incredibly hot year.
Right, yeah.
And luckily, I was running in sunglasses and a very, very sheltering hat, because I realised that whether I had a broken arm or not was to stay sheltered. So I was running in the right kit to kind of shut myself away, really, and I just went into my own world for the next 3.5 hours or whatever and just churned out
kind of some of the ultra experience coming in there, actually.
I was concerned I was going to get dehydrated because I was bleeding from my knee, and it was a very hot day, so I was concentrating on making sure I took plenty of fluids on board, because I thought the one thing that's going to stop me here. Luckily, I didn't have a bone sticking out or anything. It was all contained, so that was fine. But the one thing that's going to stop me is if I lose it because I'm dehydrated.
So obviously at that point you write off, well, the sub-3 is not happening.
Yes.
Let's just finish this thing.
Yes. Sub-3 was or wasn't going to happen by a 2 or 3 minute margin. Well, that's completely off the board once you've broken your arm. So I wasn't thinking about times at all. I was just concentrating on keeping a steady pace, getting it over with as quickly as I could and getting to hospital.
Did you have family watching you there that day that then saw you pass with a sling?
Yes.
Were they not like, what's happened, Chris?
Yes, and people were tracking me and thinking something's gone seriously wrong here.
Oh, yeah, because your pace has just gone...
it's taken him hours to get through whatever marker they were expecting me through in half an hour earlier.
Wow.
So, people knew something was wrong. But people would be looking out for me at a certain point along the way, and because I was way off that pace, they were missing me because I was in sunglasses anyway, and I wasn't where I should have been at that point in the race.
It's quite a hard thing spectating the London Marathon, trying to pick out your one athlete to come to see it.
And you don't get a second chance at it, really,
No,
do you?
that was it, and they're gone. Especially if they're running at quick pace, as you have been for many years. Oh, that was Chris. Yep. Wow, what an experience and what an amazing thing to push through. I mean, did you get many interviews after that of people? Because it's quite an interesting story.
Yes.
An ever-present breaks his arm but pushes on through.
Athletics Weekly covered it before the 2019 race. So in the build-up to the 2019 race, there were pictures of the X-ray, with his arm in 4 pieces at the top where it joins the shoulder. So it was quite an interesting story. And looking back on it, it was an experience, and I kind of laugh about it now, but at the time it was really awful. And the worst thing afterwards was, I could start running again within about 7 or 8 weeks in a manner, but the worst thing was going to bed and not being able to sleep.
It must be bad.
Turning in bed was agony. So I was not sleeping properly for about 6 or 8 weeks afterwards.
Oh, that's awful.
It's not possible to run with the injury I had, and I just had to accept that.
What a relief it must have been to have crossed the line and been like, okay, I've done another one. I didn't. It would feel so gutting to,
yes.
If you had dehydration or ambulance crew had said, no, sorry, pulled you off, whatever, it kind of cuts that chain of...
And ironically, my wife was running the race.
Oh, really?
And she was running it with a phone, so she knew something was wrong, but she wasn't any the wiser until she got to the end of the race. And my daughter was medal hanging that year, and she handed me my medal. So I came over the line and was handed my medal by my daughter, who then was really, worried about me because I was in a state.
Yeah.
And so she accompanied me to the tent where people got patched up. Of course, it was a very, very hot day, and lots of people were in a far worse state than me, but for a different reason. They were all dehydrated and delirious, and I was there completely mentally okay, but physically wrecked. And I was shipped off to St Mary's in Paddington, and I got out of there at 11:30 at night, having had an X-ray and been diagnosed with a humeral break in 4 places.
Wow. And good that it was your upper half. It wasn't, a knee or an ankle or a hip or
No,
something.
it wasn't. I could have shattered my kneecap.
Yeah, imagine if that had gone.
Luckily, I didn't. I ended up with a really bad scar on it, which was a mess. But in the grand scheme of things, I was very lucky that I didn't injure my legs. If I'd broken my leg, clearly I'd have really struggled to get around the London Marathon. But
you'd have tried. But
as you say, although we all use our upper bodies way more than anyone would give us credit for it, I'd rather break an arm than a leg.
Yeah, absolutely, of course. What time did you end up doing it in 2018?
3:54, I think it was.
Yeah, which would make some people feel sick because they're trying to break 4 hours and they're doing it with fused bones.
It was a decent first 5K. That was the trick.
Yeah, exactly. Great first 5K, and then. One of the highlights of your career and one of the biggest things in my eyes that you've done so far was in 2011, I believe it was,
yes.
You decided to run across America
yes.
and carried that out with a friend called Steve Pope.
Yes.
Was that something you've been planning for a long time? When did that idea set in?
Yes. I met Steve at the Barry 40 Ultra Race in 2003, I think it was. And we got talking and we realised we just got on well. There was this kind of instant friendship, if you like. And we kept in touch over the years. And then Steve came down to run the 24-hour race at Tooting Beck track one year. And Steve gave me a book, which was a book by an American runner called Jim Shapiro. And the book was called Meditations from the Breakdown Lane. And it was a book about Jim Shapiro's experiences of running across America himself in the early 80s. And I read the book and got completely drawn into... It's a superb book. It's a book about running, but it's also a book about a kind of spiritual journey and what you think about when you're running in the middle of nowhere for hours on end. And he's a beautiful writer. Spoke to Steve about it. And that's when we kind of hatched the idea in about 2007, 2008. It started as a joke. Oh, we're going to run across America. And over the course of about 5 or 6 weeks, the phone calls became more and more serious about it. And then Steve put into Google Maps San Francisco to New York. And instead of clicking on the car route or the plane route, he clicked on the walking route and it gave him the route. And so we basically more or less followed the Google Maps route from San Francisco to New York. We thought we'd run off the Golden Gate Bridge, but then we thought, well, it'd actually be nice to emerge from the Pacific rather than run off a bridge. And then we realised it was almost impossible to run through San Francisco as a pedestrian because you're not a car. Unless you've got 4 wheels, it's just not really designed for you. So we looked at the map, and there's a place about 10 miles south of San Francisco called Half Moon Bay. And I really liked the name Half Moon Bay. And I just thought, well, let's run from Half Moon Bay. So that's where we ran from. So we ran out of the Pacific in Half Moon Bay. but it took us 2 or 3 years from genesis, if you like, to actually starting the run.
Yeah, it's a heck of a long time, and it's such a big project as well. And just over about 3,100 miles, I think, was about the total route.
The actual route, I think, as best we could define it, was about 3,100.
A long way. And your plan, I think, when you spoke to me briefly before when we met, you talked about the idea was to do it in 80 days.
Yes, we had a 90-day visa. We thought, well, we'll do it 5 days, either side. And that's pretty much how it worked out. And the goal was to firstly not violate our visa, because we thought, well, that could be a bit sticky. And the second goal was to get to New York for the New York Marathon. As the run progressed, a few things went against us, and we could see ourselves not getting to the New York Marathon in time for the New York Marathon. And then eventually we speeded up a bit and got places. And long story short, we picked up our running numbers in New York on the way through to Brooklyn and on the way through to finishing our run. So we actually picked our numbers up about 99.8% of the way through the run.
Did you really feel like doing the marathon at the end of it, or were you like, I don't want it?
Yes and no. I mean, it was a nice kind of finishing flurry. It wasn't actually part of the transcontinental run because we'd finished it by then. But we were completely euphoric, in the sense that we'd set out and achieved what we'd set out to achieve. And the run itself was a bit of icing on the cake, I suppose.
I watched some of the documentary on YouTube. It's very good if anyone wants to watch it.
Yeah, there's a couple of clips on YouTube. There's a 13-minute, very, very short documentary, which I think you'll find putting my name in and Run Across America. And then the long documentary is called The 3,000 Mile Men, which is quite a serious documentary about the whole thing.
And that is an amazing image as you're coming down the beach and you dive into the waves, into the water. And there's a beautiful sunrise, or is it sunset?
No, it's a sunset. We thought we were going to get there at about 4 in the afternoon, but we picked up our numbers in Manhattan and we went to the reception for the elite athletes, which was on something like the 20th floor of the Hilton, and we kind of gate crashed it. We walked in there in our running kit, and in there at the time were all the athletes ready to compete the following day, and there was a lovely buffet there, and we just sort of announced ourselves as runners. And once people realised what we'd done, we were sort of brought into the fold and treated really, really well, because we were genuine runners at a running event, so nobody was going to tell us to sod off, and that was quite an experience.
What was the feeling like when diving into the water on the other side? You just run across America. Was there relief, or was it just euphoric, or would you not feel anything because you're just so tired?
Well, because we dillied and dallied a bit at this reception, we ended up unplanned arriving round about sunset, and it was a really clear day and it was a beautiful sunset. So that how we felt and the sunset kind of came together, and I was probably more emotional than Steve at the end of it. And we dived into the sea like we'd emerged from the Pacific. We dived into the Atlantic. It was a very emotional moment. We'd been planning this trip for years, and it hadn't been straightforward. I developed a problem. I thought I had a stress fracture of my tibia after about 500 miles when we were in Utah. I was worried I was going to have to support Steve on his quest to run across the States without being able to do that myself. Yeah. It was very... I think there are two things in my life, two running events in my life which really changed me as a runner. One of them was getting my first international vest, which made me feel very differently about running than before. It made me feel very enthused and happy. And the other was succeeding at this, because it could have been a spectacular failure. I could have been injured after 500 miles and looked stupid, or I could have been injured after 2,000 miles and felt, well, all that effort and nothing to show for it. But I felt very fulfilled. And diving into the sea was a very binary way of experiencing that finish. It wasn't just, oh, this is the finish, and you stop running. It was like you dive into the water and it's freezing because it's November and it's very in your face. This is it. You've finished.
It's almost like a bit of a baptism, the whole diving into the water again. What an amazing feeling.
Yeah, kind of spiritual, I suppose, yes.
You see this scene where the doubt creeps in and you're both on these hotel beds, and Steve he uses a line where he talks about the miles divided by days.
Yes.
Again, like we've referred to before, running is just numbers at the end of the day, and it's very factual. And there came to a point where you were starting to think, well, hang on, this is starting to catch up with us a bit. How close did that doubt come to being like, we might not do this?
Well, that was when my leg was hurting, and the background to this was my tibia started hurting about 300-400 miles in, and it got worse and worse and worse. And I went to see a physiotherapist who actually turned out to be a sports doctor who specialises in orthopedics, and he said, you've got a stress fracture of the tibia, you've got to stop running. And this whole thing about denial kicked in, and I said, I need a second opinion on this. So I went and saw another guy. Oh yeah, you've got a stress fracture, you need to stop running. And this is where I thought, well, I can't just stop running. I've been planning this
years.
For years.
Yeah.
So what we did was Steve downgraded each day from a run to a walk, and he walked with me, and we walked. Some days we walk 35 miles. Well, it's actually walking 35 miles in a day takes a lot of time. But we thought the only way we can keep on track with the amount of distance we need to cover each day is to just substitute walking for running. So we walked for days and days and days. We walked for about 4 days, I think it was. And then it got kind of worse. So I thought, right, we're going to take one day off completely. We're not going to run. So for one day, we just hang around in the motel. And then the next day, we started walking again. And then the next day, I tentatively started running again. And luckily, somehow or other, maybe it wasn't a stress fracture of the tibia, it was okay. And after that, it got better. But anyway, the conversation you're picking up on, the miles divided by days conversation, was at the peak of our doubt that I could carry on because the days were beginning to drift. And I think we'd had the day off at that point, and it wasn't 40 miles a day, it was 42 miles a day or 43 miles a day.
The math doesn't lie.
It very quickly mounts up. So that was the conversation we were having. And I was getting into the mindset of thinking I really ought to stop now and support Steve. But for whatever reason, that didn't happen. And thankfully, we got back on track. And from the Rockies onwards, we were strong. And they say that if you get to the Rockies, you will run across America. But that first 1,000 miles is the period when all the adaptation takes place.
Yes.
And all the injuries that might occur crop up.
Wow. Yeah. I love that expression. When you get to the Rockies, then you'll run across America. In terms of someone trying to understand your motivation behind it, I realised there was a little bit of a consistent theme, and one of the things you referred to was this age thing. Because I think as you start to move to a certain age, I spoke to my own dad about this, that ticking clock is always there, and you are just aware that, look, if I want to do something, I should probably get on and do it,
Yes.
And you refer to that a couple of times in the documentary, and that was obviously a big motivator. There must also be a bit of an element of, I've kind of got one shot at this. So for you use the term not wanting to regret it on your deathbed.
Yeah.
Has that always been quite a thing, like of just, I want to tick these boxes and get it done right now?
Yes, I didn't want to feel unfulfilled, and I didn't want to always think, oh gosh, if only... I mean, there's another quote which is nothing to do with running, but it's one I'm sure you've heard it as well, which is nobody on their deathbed ever wished they'd spent more time at work. And it's that whole idea that when you are looking back on your life, if you ever have the luxury of doing that, rather than being falling under a bus, you're going to remember those really spiritual, important moments in your life and maybe draw nourishment from them or experience a sense of regret. And I didn't want to experience that sense of regret. I wanted to feel that I'd struck while the iron was hot.
Yes, exactly.
I'd done something when I could. I didn't assume it could always wait for another year and then find out that the opportunity was lost.
So where does your mindset go now? Do you feel fairly fulfilled? Are there still things you want to tick off?
Yes.
You are in that age where you can do stuff. You're running park runs at the moment in low 18s. It's there for the taking. So are there still some boxes that you want to cross?
Yes, I think the most obvious one looming now is if I can do it, and I say this is an if rather than a when. If I can run sub 3 in 6 decades, I would like to do that. Perhaps more predictably, I hope, I would like to run the first 40 London marathons. So I've got one more to go. When people say, how many London marathons do you want to run? The number 50 sort of is looming. It's not that far away from 39. But as I always say, I need to be alive.
Always helpful.
I need to avoid injury and illness. Who knows what's around the corner?
Yeah, it's so unpredictable, isn't it? It's an amazing sort of macrocosm race going on here. There's 10 of you left who are doing it. And
some of the guys, bearing in mind, the oldest ever present is a guy called Ken Jones. And Ken... not every year, but certainly in a couple of years recently, he's been the oldest competitor in the race. Ken is
How old is he?
Ken's 85 or 86.
Flipping heck.
Hats off to him.
Yeah.
He's running marathons and he's 4 or 5 years off being 90. Point is, I can't speak for him, but I don't think he's planning on just doing it forever and ever. I think this is the mindset that possibly kicks in with some people. You get to the point where you think, I'd rather leave the race on my terms than feel compelled to pull out.
That was going to be my next question. You hit right on it. Was, do you bow out on your own terms? It's like you see it in professional sport. It's the guy who, it's the jewel thief. There's always that one more. Muhammad Ali went on far too long. And it's, where is that point where you go, yes, I'm going to leave on my terms when I had a good race and I did my final sub 3 or whatever it is. Where do you think your head's at on that? Do you think after 50 you would be able to stop, or do you think, 51?
I think the jury's out on that. I don't know how I'd feel after 50. I certainly won't feel like that after 40. I'm still relatively, I'm the youngest ever present. I'm still relatively...
Oh, you're the youngest of the 10? Oh,
yes.
Interesting. Okay.
The next youngest is actually 70. So I'm the youngest by 10 years. because I did my first one when I was 22, so I was a mere lad. Yeah, it's tempting to say I'll just do them till I drop, and I have been quoted saying that before, and I don't think my mindset's really changed at the moment. If somebody were looking to leave under their own terms, then 40 London marathons is a more obvious and perhaps better time to do that than 41.
Yes,
or
so
42.
it's a nice round number, and
Yes.
you can go on that day knowing it's your last. But you're right, it's tough. The very nature of runners, and it's kind of within it's kind of what got you to the dance, really, was that ability to keep pushing. That's essentially what you do and why you've had the success. So who's to say it wouldn't be a thing with pushing to continue to do another London Marathon? I mean, like you say, it's so hard now to get into London Marathon on ballot alone. It's so unlikely because there's such large numbers.
Yes.
The fact that you're getting an email saying, Chris, here's your
Yes,
it's amazing.
I'm very, very fortunate, and the London Marathon have supported the ever-presence very well over the years, and it's an enormous privilege to be part of the race year in, year out.
Well, Chris, that's been amazing. Yeah, it's been spectacular to hear it. I mean, amazing career, and I think it's fantastic to hear about this progression from the shorter to the longer, and the success with the ultras, and that kind of second coming you had with the ultra experience, and certainly the London Marathon. I wish you every success. I hope that you make the sub-3 in the 6th decade.
Well, it won't be for the want of trying.
No. Well, Chris, thank you so much for speaking to me, and I wish you all the best for the future.
Thank you very much for taking the time. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Hello, Harry here. Thank you for listening to this episode. As always, just a huge thank you for your continued support. I can't tell you how much joy I get from creating and sharing these episodes. And if you are new to the podcast, a very warm welcome to the Jog On crew. Make sure that you're subscribed to future episodes, and be sure to go back and check some more out that pique your interest. Search for Jog On with Harry Morgan in YouTube for the videos. You can follow us on Instagram at Jog On Podcast. And if you have a guest in mind, get in contact by emailing thisisjogon@gmail.com. I'm Harry Morgan, and this is Jog On.